What happens when a man who built an empire on grit and resilience walks into what should be a friendly conversation, only to find himself in a carefully laid trap? When Sylvester Stallone, the icon who taught millions that victory isn't about how hard you hit, but how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage that autumn night. No one expected they were about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire, a battle between respect and ridicule, and ultimately a moment that would remind the world why some legends can never be broken. The studio buzzed with anticipation as the house band's final notes faded into the Los Angeles night. Stage lights bathed the set in that familiar warm glow that's become synonymous with casual celebrity chat and easy laughs. The audience settled into their seats, programs clutched in hands, phones silenced, ready for another entertaining evening of Hollywood banter. They'd come expecting the usual formula: softball questions, rehearsed anecdotes, a plug for the latest project, maybe a funny clip or two. What they were about to witness would shatter every expectation they'd brought through those studio doors. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with the confidence of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. His signature grin wide and welcoming, his movements choreographed by years of practiced ease. Tonight, he announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of enthusiasm and irony that's become his trademark. We have a very special guest, the man who made mumbling an art form, Rocky himself, Sylvester Stallone. The crowd erupted, but there was something in Jimmy's tone, something almost imperceptible to those who didn't know what to listen for. A slight edge, a hint of sharpness wrapped in humor's clothing. Stallone emerged from backstage. The applause intensified. At 78 years old, he still commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Dressed impeccably in a sharp black blazer, over a deep maroon shirt that caught the stage lights perfectly. He moved with that distinctive combination of power and grace that only comes from decades of physical discipline. His presence was magnetic, undeniable. This wasn't just another aging actor desperately clinging to past glory. This was a man who'd fought his way up from sleeping in bus stations to becoming a global phenomenon. And every step he took carried that history. He waved to the audience, his smile polite but reserved. His eyes already reading the room with the instinct of someone who'd learned long ago to recognize danger before it fully revealed itself. Those who knew Stallone's story, who understood the battles he'd fought both on screen and off, might have noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw set just slightly tighter than usual. But to most, he was simply the gracious celebrity, grateful for the applause, settling into the guest chair beside his host. "It's good to be here," Stallone said, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly quality that's become as iconic as the characters he's portrayed. Jimmy leaned forward, his posture friendly, open, disarming. "Good to have you, Sly," he replied. And then, almost as an afterthought, added with a grin, "I mean, I was told you'd be bringing wisdom, experience, a few unintelligible syllables, and maybe a protein shake." The audience laughed, a ripple of amusement that seemed innocent enough on the surface. Stallone chuckled, but for those paying attention, his eyes told a different story. They narrowed just fractionally. Just enough. "Well, I left the protein shake backstage," he replied, his tone still light. "Didn't want to outshine your green juice?" Jimmy smirked, clearly pleased with the comeback. "Touché." He shifted in his chair, settling in for what he clearly thought would be an easy evening of trading barbs with a good-natured celebrity. Little did he know that the man sitting across from him had spent a lifetime in far more hostile territory than a late-night set, and every instinct honed in those experiences was already being activated. The conversation moved forward, seeming to flow naturally enough. Jimmy asked about Stallone's latest film, another action project that had brought the actor back to familiar territory. "So, let's talk about your new movie," Jimmy said, his tone carrying just a hint of condescension. "Another action flick. Or did you finally decide to make something with plot?" The audience laughed, but the sound was becoming more uncertain now. Something was shifting in the atmosphere, though most couldn't quite identify what. Stallone kept his expression carefully neutral, his decades of acting experience serving him well. "It's a story about redemption," he explained, his voice measured and calm. "A veteran confronting the ghosts of his past. Something that speaks to real-world pain." "Deep," Jimmy responded with mock awe, his eyes glittering with what he clearly thought was good-natured teasing. "And here, I thought it was just another reason to flex those biceps on screen." More laughter, but it was thinner now, more hesitant. Some audience members shifted in their seats, others exchanged glances. Stallone didn't laugh. His expression remained composed, but there was steel beneath the surface, hardening with each passing moment. "Sometimes pain needs muscle," he replied evenly, each word chosen with precision, not to show off, but to carry the weight. The temperature in the studio dropped. Not dramatically, not obviously, but anyone attuned to human interaction could feel it. The air became heavier, charged with something that hadn't been there moments before. Jimmy looked amused rather than concerned. Clearly enjoying what he perceived as a verbal sparring match he was winning. "Wow, that's poetic," he said, leaning back in his chair with theatrical appreciation. "Did Rambo teach you that, or was it Rocky?" Stallone leaned back as well, mirroring Jimmy's posture, but with an entirely different energy. "Funny," he said, quietly. "I always thought comedy should punch up, not down." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise flickering across his face for just an instant before his professional mask reasserted itself. "Just having fun," he said quickly, his smile tightening at the edges. "Don't want to get body slammed on live TV." "Don't worry," Stallone replied, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I only hit when it's scripted." The tension was building now, unmistakable. The studio audience, trained by years of late-night viewing to expect friendly banter and harmless jokes, suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory. This wasn't the comfortable rhythm they knew. This was something else entirely, something that made them sit up straighter, made them pay attention in a way they hadn't expected to. Behind the cameras, crew members exchanged glances. The segment? Producer, watching from the control room, leaned forward in his chair, suddenly alert. This was either going to be television gold or a complete disaster, and the line between the two was razor thin. Jimmy, sensing he needed to regain control of the conversation, tried to steer things towards safer ground. Well, let's go back," he said, his tone suggesting magnanimity as though he were generously changing the subject. "The first Rocky film, you wrote it in 3 days, right? Did you just run out of crayons?" A ripple of discomfort ran through the audience. The joke landed wrong, too harsh, too pointed. Some people laughed nervously, but many didn't laugh at all. They could sense that something was being crossed. Some line that existed between playful ribbing and genuine disrespect. Stallone paused. The silence stretched for just a beat too long. Pregnant with meaning. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "I wrote it with everything I had," he said. Each word weighted with history, with truth, with the kind of reality that can't be joked away while sleeping in a bus terminal trying to sell my dog to eat. So yeah, crayons weren't really the priority. The crowd went quiet, completely, utterly quiet. The kind of silence that screams louder than any applause. Jimmy's face registered something that might have been regret, might have been calculation, might have been both. He'd pushed too far, and everyone in the studio knew it. Stallone leaned forward, his posture changing from defensive to assertive. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice still controlled, but carrying an unmistakable warning. "Sometimes you crack jokes, sometimes you crack dignity. Be careful what you're breaking tonight." The stage was set. The gloves were off. What had begun as a standard celebrity interview had transformed into something far more dangerous, far more real. The audience sat transfixed, uncertain whether they should be excited or uncomfortable, aware that they were witnessing something that didn't follow the usual script. And in the control room, producers scrambled, trying to decide whether to let this play out or cut to commercial early, ultimately choosing to let the cameras roll. Unable to resist the magnetic pull of genuine conflict unfolding live, Jimmy Kimmel was no stranger to confrontation. Years of hosting had taught him how to navigate difficult guests, how to turn awkward moments into comedy gold, how to maintain control even when things threatened to spiral. But as he sat across from Sylvester Stallone in that moment, with the air crackling between them and the audience holding its collective breath, he made a critical miscalculation. He assumed he still held the power. He assumed that his position as host, his home field advantage, his ability to shape the narrative through editing and audience manipulation would protect him. He was wrong. "You should do stand-up." That comeback was almost intelligible. The emphasis on almost was deliberate. Another jab at Stallone's speech. Another attempt to diminish the man sitting across from him. Stallone didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, almost serene, but his eyes had gone cold. "And you should try sincerity sometime," he replied quietly. "It might shock your audience." The crowd let out an audible sound, a collective ooh that rippled through the studio like a wave. They could feel it now, the shift in power, the realization that this wasn't going to be another easy victory for their host. Some audience members leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were about to witness something that might make them complicit simply by being present. Jimmy was clearly enjoying himself, or at least performing enjoyment with practiced ease. He pressed further, apparently unable or unwilling to recognize the warning signs that were becoming more obvious with each exchange. "Let's be honest," he said, his tone suggesting he was about to reveal some uncomfortable truth. "You've made more sequels than Hollywood has original ideas. Ever think of just letting it go?" Stallone crossed his legs slowly, deliberately, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and readiness. "I keep telling stories people want to hear," he said, his voice steady as stone. "Maybe that's the part that bothers you," Jimmy chuckled. But the sound was forced now, theatrical. "Or maybe it's that you keep playing the same guy with a new haircut." The response was immediate and devastating. Better than being a new haircut with the same jokes. The audience roared. Not polite laughter, not nervous titters, but genuine, enthusiastic applause. They'd chosen their side, and it wasn't the hosts. Jimmy smiled. But the expression was tight now, strained around the edges. Okay, touche," he said, trying to sound gracious in defeat while already loading up for his next attack. "But seriously, isn't there a part of you that worries people only see you as a punchline?" Stallone leaned in, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every year he'd spent fighting for respect, for recognition, for the right to tell his stories his way. Only when hosts like you try to write the jokes. He paused, letting the words land before delivering the follow-up that would shift the entire dynamic of the conversation. "Let me remind you, Rocky wasn't just a film. It was hope for a lot of people who had none." The atmosphere in the studio transformed. The applause that followed wasn't just supportive. It was reverent. People weren't just clapping for a good comeback. They were applauding for something deeper. Something that reminded them why they'd fallen in love with Stallone's work in the first place. This wasn't about movies or sequels or box office returns. This was about meaning, about the stories we tell ourselves to survive, about the characters that become part of our lives and help us. Through our darkest moments, Jimmy tried to reclaim the momentum. But he was floundering now, reaching for ammunition that kept misfiring. "But you're a millionaire now, right?" he said, his tone taking on an edge of desperation disguised as aggressive journalism. "Don't you think it's a bit rich, talking about struggle?" Stallone's voice deepened, taking on a quality that made every person in that studio sit up and pay attention. "Struggle doesn't expire with a paycheck," he said. And in those words was a lifetime of experience, fighting through poverty, rejection, and failure. Maintaining dignity when the world told him he had no right to it. It leaves scars, and it teaches you to recognize when you're being used for someone else's punchline. The silence that followed was profound. Jimmy sat frozen for a beat, genuinely unsure how to respond. "You think I'm using you?" he finally asked, and for the first time all evening, there was something real in his voice, something unscripted. Stallone didn't blink. "You tell me." The audience held its breath. Camera operators adjusted their frames instinctively, sensing that something important was happening, something that needed to be captured. In the control room, the director whispered frantically into headsets, trying to figure out whether they were witnessing disaster or brilliance, ultimately deciding it didn't matter because there was no way they were cutting away from this. Jimmy looked uncomfortable now, genuinely rattled in a way his practiced professionalism couldn't quite conceal. He forced a laugh, the sound brittle in the heavy air. "Well, folks," he said, addressing the audience as though they could provide him refuge, "I didn't realize we booked a philosophy major tonight." Stallone smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Funny," he said quietly. "I thought we booked a host." The studio erupted, not with laughter, but with applause, with cheers, with a kind of enthusiastic response that makes it clear who the audience has aligned themselves with. Jimmy clenched his jaw, trying to maintain composure, but the game had changed, and everyone knew it. He was no longer winning. He was no longer in control. And with each passing moment, that reality became more obvious. He scrambled for a new angle, reaching for the kind of question that might put Stallone back on the defensive. "So, how do you respond to critics who say your career is just nostalgia now?" he asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. "That without the past, you're not much in the present." Stallone's tone turned colder, dropping into a register that carried unmistakable authority. "Critics talk," he said simply. "Legends work, and I don't need to relive the past. I built it." There was a pause, a moment where the entire studio seemed to collectively process what they'd just heard. And then the audience erupted in thunderous applause. It wasn't just support anymore. It was respect, genuine and earned, the kind that can't be manufactured or manipulated. People were standing now, some of them unable to contain their appreciation for what they were witnessing. Jimmy leaned forward one last time, making a final attempt to regain some semblance of control. "Come on, Sly," he said, trying to inject warmth back into his voice. "Can't you take a joke?" Stallone's smile faded completely. His expression became serious, intent, the face of a man who'd reached a decision. "Can you take the truth?" Silence fell over the studio like a curtain. The kind of silence that swallows everything, making people aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeats. It was the silence of a moment that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Jimmy looked at the camera, his professional instincts kicking in, even as his composure crumbled. He forced a grin that looked more like a grimace. "We'll be right back after this short break," he announced, his voice tight. "If Stallone doesn't punch me before then," but everyone watching knew the truth. This wasn't just a break. This was a battle line being drawn, and the war was far from over. The cameras cut to commercial. But in the studio, the tension remained, thick and unmistakable. A living thing that filled every corner of the space. The commercial break felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. Makeup artists rushed onto the stage, dabbing at Jimmy's forehead where sweat had begun to bead despite the carefully controlled studio temperature. Stallone sat calmly in his chair, declining offered water. His posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. The audience buzzed with conversation, people turning to their neighbors, whispering frantically about what they were witnessing. On social media, clips from the first segment were already spreading like wildfire. Hashtags forming spontaneously as viewers around the world began tuning in. Sensing that something extraordinary was happening, the lights snapped back on with jarring intensity. The stage manager counted down silently, fingers dropping one by one until the on-air light blazed red. Jimmy straightened his jacket, smoothed his hair, and put on his polished grin-like armor. "We're back with the one and only Sylvester Stallone," he announced to the cameras. To the studio, to the millions now watching at home. Then, unable to resist, he added, "Voice of a generation. The man, the myth, the what is it now? 80-some-year-old action figure." The audience's laughter was scattered, uncertain. They'd seen where this led before the break, and they were wary now. Like spectators at a boxing match who'd watched the challenger land. Several solid blows and were wondering if the champion could recover. Stallone let the laughter die down before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried that same gravelly authority. But there was something new in it now, something that suggested his patience was wearing thin. Better to be molded in stone than made of plastic. The crowd erupted again, louder this time, more confident in their support. There was a palpable shift in the studio, a divide forming between those who still stood with their host and those who'd been completely won over by the legend sitting in the guest chair. Jimmy noticed it, felt it in the way the applause seemed to bypass him entirely, flowing directly from the audience to his guest. "Well, I have to say," Jimmy continued, pretending not to feel the change in the room's atmosphere. "Your fans are loyal, almost aggressively so. Like they think you're still that scrappy underdog from Philly." "I am," Stallone said simply, with a kind of certainty that comes from absolute self-knowledge. "I just wear better shoes now," Jimmy scoffed. A sound that came out harsher than he probably intended. "But come on, Sly. Haven't we moved past the whole underdog thing? Isn't it time to hang up the gloves? Literally and metaphorically."